There's a quiet power in understanding emotional dynamics, especially when it comes to the push-pull between connection and distance. Some people chase, some withdraw, and then there's a rare kind of person who doesn't do either in the way you'd expect. This type doesn't beg for love, nor do they run from it. Instead, they shift the entire dynamic. And interestingly, they are the ones who often make even the most emotionally unavailable people stop, rethink, and lean in. Most people confuse emotional presence with neediness, and that confusion is exactly what creates imbalance in so many relationships. On the surface, both can look similar. Both involve caring, expressing feelings, and wanting connection. But underneath, they come from completely different places, and the difference is everything. Neediness is driven by fear. It's that subtle anxiety that says, I might lose this person, so I need to hold on tighter. It shows up as over-explaining, over-texting, over-giving. It's the urge to fill every silence, to fix every problem, to make sure the other person never drifts too far away. And while the intention is often pure, the energy behind it feels heavy. It creates pressure. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're trying to control an outcome that should be mutual. Emotional presence, on the other hand, is grounded. It's not about trying to secure the connection, it's about experiencing it fully in the moment. When you're emotionally present, you're not constantly calculating where you stand or worrying about what comes next. You're engaged, you're open, and you're honest, but there's no grasping, there's no urgency to prove your worth. You're simply there. And that difference is incredibly powerful, especially when it comes to someone who tends to pull away. An avoidant person can sense neediness almost instantly. Not because they're overly critical, but because they're highly sensitive to anything that feels like pressure or expectation. The moment they feel like they're responsible for someone else's emotional stability, their instinct is to create distance. It's not personal, it's protective. But emotional presence doesn't trigger that reaction. In fact, it does the opposite. When you're emotionally present, you allow space without turning it into a problem. You don't interpret every delay, every pause, or every moment of distance as rejection. You stay steady, and that steadiness creates something rare, safety without pressure. It sends a message that says, I enjoy you, I value this connection, but I'm not dependent on it to feel okay. And that's incredibly disarming. Because now, the other person doesn't feel like they have to perform or constantly meet an unspoken demand. They can actually relax into the connection. What makes this even more compelling is that emotional presence doesn't mean holding back or pretending you don't care. It's not about playing games or acting distant. You still express yourself. You still show interest, but it comes from a place of choice, not fear. You respond because you want to, not because you're trying to keep someone from leaving. You share because it feels natural, not because you're trying to secure validation. And that shift changes how everything is received. Instead of feeling like they're being pulled, the other person feels invited. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they feel intrigued. And for someone who's used to keeping their distance, that intrigue can be the very thing that makes them lean in. Because at the end of the day, people don't connect more deeply when they feel needed. They connect more deeply when they feel free and still choose to stay. There's a paradox at the heart of avoidant behavior that most people completely misunderstand. The very people who seem the least interested in closeness are often the ones who crave it the most. But the way they experience that desire is different. It's layered with caution, hesitation, and a deep instinct to protect their independence. On one level, they want connection. They want someone who understands them, who sees them, who brings warmth into their life. But on another level, that same closeness can feel threatening. Not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because intimacy to them often feels like a loss of control. So they resist. And that resistance doesn't always look obvious. Sometimes it shows up as mixed signals, being warm one moment and distant the next. Sometimes it looks like hesitation to commit or pulling away just when things start to feel deeper. It can even look like focusing on flaws or creating reasons why the connection isn't right. But underneath all of that is a simple internal conflict. I want this, but I don't know if I can handle what comes with it. This is why traditional approaches to love often backfire. When someone senses distance, their instinct is to close the gap, to reassure more, give more, show more. They think, if I just prove how much I care, they'll feel safe enough to stay. But for someone who values space as a form of safety, that approach can feel overwhelming. The more they feel pursued, the more they feel like they're being pulled into something they might not be ready for. And instead of moving closer, they create more distance to regain that sense of control. Yet here's where it gets interesting. Even as they pull away, they're still paying attention. They're still aware of the connection. In fact, sometimes the distance is not about losing interest. It's about trying to manage the intensity of what they feel. Because when something feels meaningful, the stakes are higher. And higher stakes can trigger a stronger instinct to protect themselves. This is why they can resist someone they genuinely like. Not because the connection isn't there, but because it matters enough to scare them. And when you understand this, you stop taking their behavior at face value. You stop interpreting distance as a lack of care and instead see it as a reflection of internal conflict. That doesn't mean you excuse inconsistency or accept less than you deserve, but it does mean you respond differently. Instead of trying to force clarity, you allow space for it to develop. Instead of chasing reassurance, you stay grounded in your own sense of stability. Because the truth is, avoidants don't move closer because they're convinced. They move closer because they feel safe enough to choose it. And safety for them isn't built through pressure. It's built through consistency, patience, and the absence of emotional demands they're not ready to meet. When they feel like they have the freedom to step in at their own pace, something shifts. The resistance softens. The walls lower little by little. And the connection that once felt overwhelming begins to feel possible. So, while it may seem like they're pushing love away, what they're really doing is trying to approach it in a way that doesn't cost them their sense of self. And when that balance is respected rather than challenged, their natural desire for connection has room to finally come forward. There's a quiet strength in self-containment that most people overlook because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't chase attention, it doesn't demand reassurance, and it certainly doesn't try to control how someone else feels. But make no mistake, this is one of the most powerful traits you can bring into any connection. Self-containment isn't about being closed off or emotionally distant. It's not about pretending you don't care or suppressing what you feel. In fact, it's the opposite. You feel everything. You just don't hand over the responsibility of those feelings to someone else. When someone lacks self-containment, their emotional state becomes tied to another person's behavior. A delayed reply can shift their mood. A slight change in tone can create anxiety. They start reading into everything, trying to find certainty where there isn't any. And in that process, they unintentionally give away their sense of stability. But when you're self-contained, your emotional center stays with you. You can enjoy someone's presence without depending on it. You can miss them without feeling incomplete. You can care deeply without losing your sense of balance. And that creates a completely different energy, one that feels calm, grounded, and incredibly attractive. Because now you're not engaging from a place of need. You're engaging from a place of choice. You choose to show up. You choose to invest. You choose to connect. But your sense of self doesn't rise and fall based on how the other person responds. And that's where the power lies, especially when it comes to someone who is sensitive to pressure or emotional intensity. An avoidant person is constantly scanning for signs that a connection might become overwhelming. They're looking for cues that they'll be expected to carry more than they're ready for. And when they sense that, even subtly, their instinct is to pull back. But self-containment removes that pressure entirely. It communicates without words, I'm responsible for myself. And that message is incredibly freeing. Because now the other person doesn't feel like they have to manage your emotions or meet unspoken expectations. They don't feel like one wrong move will create tension or disappointment. Instead, they experience the connection as something that adds to their life, not something that demands from it. What's even more interesting is how this shifts the dynamic over time. When you're not constantly seeking reassurance, the other person often becomes more aware of your presence. When you're not chasing, they start to notice the space you leave behind. And when you're not trying to control the outcome, they feel more inclined to step in voluntarily. This isn't about strategy, it's about alignment. You're no longer trying to hold the connection together on your own. You're allowing it to exist naturally, with both people contributing. And if that contribution isn't there, self-containment gives you the clarity to see it for what it is. You don't rationalize inconsistency. You don't overinvest in potential. You simply recognize when something isn't being met, and you have the strength to step back without losing yourself. That's what makes self-containment so powerful. It keeps you open but not exposed. It allows you to connect, but not at the cost of your stability. And in a world where so many people are trying to secure love by holding on tighter, the person who can remain grounded, steady, and whole within themselves becomes impossible to ignore. There's a subtle but critical balance between being emotionally available and overgiving, and most people don't realize when they've crossed that line. It often starts with good intentions. You want to be supportive, understanding, and kind. You want the other person to feel safe with you. So you listen more, you give more, you accommodate more. And before you know it, you're doing all the emotional heavy lifting in the connection. But here's the problem. Emotional safety isn't created by how much you give. It's created by how balanced the exchange feels. When you overgive, even if it's coming from a genuine place, it can unintentionally create pressure. It sets a pace and intensity that the other person may not be ready or willing to match. And instead of bringing them closer, it can make them feel like they're falling short, like they're being measured against a standard they didn't agree to. For someone who already struggles with closeness, that feeling can be enough to make them step back. Emotional safety, on the other hand, comes from consistency without excess. It's not about saying everything perfectly or always knowing the right thing to do. It's about showing up in a way that feels steady and predictable without overwhelming the connection. You're present, you're attentive, but you're not trying to accelerate intimacy beyond what's naturally unfolding. And that's where the difference lies. Overgiving often comes from a need to secure the connection. There's a quiet hope that if you just show enough care, enough patience, enough understanding, the other person will meet you there. But that kind of giving has an unspoken expectation attached to it. Even if you don't say it out loud, it's there. And people can feel that. They can sense when your kindness is tied to an outcome, when your effort is trying to create a certain response. And that's when it starts to feel less like safety and more like pressure. But when you offer emotional safety without overgiving, there's no hidden agenda. You're not trying to earn their affection. You're not trying to prove your worth. You're simply showing up as someone who is open, grounded, and clear about what you bring to the table. You listen, but you don't take responsibility for fixing everything. You care, but you don't sacrifice your own needs in the process. You're supportive, but you don't carry the weight of the entire connection on your shoulders. And that creates an environment where the other person can actually breathe, because now they're not being overwhelmed by intensity or expectations. They're experiencing a connection that feels calm, natural, and mutual. And here's the part that often surprises people. When you stop overgiving, you don't lose the connection. You give it a chance to become real, because now the other person has space to step up. They have room to contribute, to invest, to show their own level of interest. And that's something you can't force. It has to come from them. If it does, the connection grows in a way that feels balanced and sustainable. If it doesn't, you see that clearly without having drained yourself trying to make it work. That's what emotional safety is really about. It's not about giving more. It's about creating a space where both people can show up fully without one person losing themselves in the process. And when you master that balance, you stop chasing connection and start experiencing it in its healthiest form. There's a version of detachment that people often misunderstand. They hear the word and assume it means becoming cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. They think it requires pulling back, acting indifferent, or pretending not to care. But that's not the kind of detachment that creates attraction. That's the kind that quietly destroys connection. Real detachment is something far more refined. It's not about disconnecting from your feelings. It's about disconnecting from the need to control the outcome. You're still present. You're still warm. You're still engaged. But you're no longer gripping the connection so tightly that it starts to feel fragile. And that shift changes everything. When someone is attached to an outcome, it shows up in subtle ways. They analyze every message, they anticipate every response, they feel unsettled when things don't go exactly as expected. Their energy becomes focused on maintaining the connection at all costs, and in doing so, they unintentionally create tension. Because now the interaction carries weight. It feels like something is on the line. And that pressure, even when unspoken, can be felt by the other person. Detachment removes that pressure. It allows the connection to breathe. When you're detached in a healthy way, you're not constantly trying to figure out where you stand. You're not chasing certainty or forcing clarity before it naturally arrives. You're allowing things to unfold moment by moment without rushing the process. And that creates a completely different experience for the other person. Instead of feeling like they're being evaluated or pulled in a certain direction, they feel free to engage at their own pace. There's no urgency, no hidden demand, no sense that they have to meet a certain expectation to keep your interest. Ironically, that freedom is what often draws them closer. Because people are far more likely to invest in something when they feel like it's their choice, not their obligation. And this is especially powerful with someone who tends to pull away. An avoidant person is highly sensitive to anything that feels like pressure or loss of independence. The moment they sense that a connection might require more than they're ready to give, their instinct is to create distance. But when you're detached in a grounded, healthy way, you remove that trigger. You're not trying to lock them in. You're not trying to speed things up. You're simply showing up as someone who enjoys the connection but doesn't depend on it. And that energy is incredibly disarming. Because now, instead of feeling like they need to escape, they start to feel curious. They start to lean in, not because they have to, but because they want to. What makes this even more powerful is that your detachment protects you just as much as it attracts them. You're no longer overinvesting in potential. You're no longer ignoring red flags just to keep something going. You're no longer tying your self-worth to how someone else shows up. You're grounded in your own value regardless of the outcome. And that creates a quiet confidence that can't be faked. It says, without words, I'm here because I want to be, but I'll be just as whole if this doesn't work out. That's the kind of presence that changes the dynamic completely. Because now you're not someone trying to be chosen. You're someone who is choosing. And when someone feels that, they don't feel pushed away. They feel drawn in. There's a fundamental shift that happens when you stop seeing yourself as an option and start seeing yourself as the standard. It's not loud, it's not arrogant, and it's not about proving anything to anyone. It's a quiet internal decision about what you accept, what you allow, and how you expect to be treated. Most people, without realizing it, operate from an option mindset. They adjust themselves to fit the situation. They tolerate inconsistency. They make excuses for behavior that doesn't meet their needs. And they do it because they don't want to lose the connection. So they compromise little by little, hoping that if they're patient enough or understanding enough, things will eventually fall into place. But what that actually does is lower the bar. It teaches the other person what is acceptable, and if inconsistency is accepted, it becomes the norm. Becoming the standard flips that completely. It means you're no longer trying to adapt to whatever is given. You're clear about what you require for a connection to work. Not in a rigid or demanding way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way. You understand your value, and you don't negotiate it just to keep someone around. This doesn't mean you expect perfection. It doesn't mean you walk away at the first sign of difficulty. What it means is that you recognize the difference between effort and excuses, between genuine interest and occasional convenience, and you respond accordingly. When someone shows up consistently, you meet them there. When someone pulls away or becomes unreliable, you don't chase to close the gap. You step back and observe. Because being the standard isn't about controlling the other person's behavior. It's about controlling your response to it. You don't reward inconsistency with more of your time and energy. You don't overextend yourself to compensate for their lack of effort. You simply align your investment with what's being given. And that creates clarity. Because now, the connection either rises to meet your standard, or it falls away on its own. There's no confusion, no guessing, no endless waiting for potential to turn into reality. And here's where it becomes incredibly powerful. When you hold yourself to a standard, it changes how the other person sees you. You're no longer someone who will accept anything just to keep the connection alive. You're someone who values themselves enough to walk away from anything that doesn't feel right. And that creates a sense of respect that can't be forced. Because people naturally value what they feel they could lose. Not because you're playing games or creating artificial distance, but because your presence is no longer guaranteed. It has to be met. It has to be earned through consistency, effort, and genuine interest. And for someone who is used to keeping people at arm's length, this can be a turning point. Because now they're not in control of the dynamic in the same way. They can't rely on you always being there regardless of how they show up. They have to decide whether they're willing to step forward and meet you where you stand. And if they do, the connection becomes something real, something mutual. If they don't, you don't lose yourself trying to make it work. That's the essence of becoming the standard. It's not about demanding more. It's about refusing to accept less. And when you truly embody that, you stop chasing validation and start attracting people who naturally rise to meet you where you are.